My name is Anna Sadnicka. I'm a neurologist and researcher interested in dystonia. As part of Dystonia Awareness Month, it gives me great pleasure to discuss task-specific dystonia and some current research. So firstly, what is task-specific dystonia? Well, it can be defined as a movement disorder that interferes with the performance of a particular task or skill, such as writing, playing a musical instrument, or participating in a sport. Therefore, if this violinist experiences task-specific dystonia, they experience difficulty in finger control only when playing. In other contexts, such as typing or writing, the hand will function normally. Task-specific dystonia can complicate the performance of any skilled task, and writing dystonia is one of the most common. However, certain groups are at greater risk. Over 1% of professional musicians can be affected. And since the disorder can often end performance careers, it is both devastating for the individual but also has wider impact for our society. So let's now put the spotlight on the science and the current ideas of what causes task-specific dystonia. This is a pioneering neurosurgeon called Penfield, who, whilst performing open brain surgery in awake patients for epilepsy, discovered that tiny electrical currents to the surface of the brain evoked experiences in the patients, sensations over different body parts. The particular area, which we call primary sensory cortex, appeared to have a map of the entire human body. So different regions of this cortex represented different parts of the human body. This slightly grotesque 3D model of Penfield's sensory maps can be called the sensory homunculus, meaning little man. Along the strip of sensory cortex, the entire body map can be reconstructed, and the importance of manual dexterity is emphasised by the relatively large size of the brain devoted to the hand. Now, this story became intertwined with the dystonia literature after an influential model for task-specific dystonia was published by Nancy Bill in the late 1990s. In this model, monkeys were trained to grasp hundreds of times a day for reward, and they were trained until performance dropped to the extent that they had a painful limb held in an abnormal posture. And when researchers looked at the sensory maps in their brains and compared them to healthy monkeys, they found that the hand maps were highly disordered and the representation of different body parts had started to overlap. This research was then repeated in humans, in task-specific dystonia, using different research modalities. And for a number of decades, our literature has been dominated by the idea that task-specific dystonia is caused by a disordered sensory homunculus. We are now in 2020, 70 years after these original maps were published by Penfield, and there have been many advances in terms of how we can measure brain activity and how to analyse the patterns observed. One of these advances is a technique called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. This pattern looks at the changes in blood flow in the brain in response to different tasks and can pick up activation patterns when we move individual fingers. This is therefore a fascinating medium by which to explore musicians' dystonia. So I'd now like to share some of my research. Can these new methods give us greater insight into how dystonia is represented in the brain? In order to conduct the experiment, we first built a finger box that looks a bit like a piano that had small levers beneath each finger that passively elevated each finger at particular times. After performing the task in an fMRI scanner, in which multiple repetitions are performed, you can get activation patterns which look like this. We are now looking at the side of the brain, zooming in on the region of the sensory cortex that lights up when our fingers are passively moved, and we can see high activity coloured yellow and low activity coloured blue. Each box is the activation pattern for a different finger, and you can start to see some of the complexity of these maps that's obtained. If we were to plot one of these maps in 3 dimensions, it would look a bit like this, with various peaks and undulations. And we now have to decide how to summarise these activation patterns. So one approach has been to take the point of maximal activity, the highest peak. Another approach is to weight all of the different values across this entire region of interest and then arrive at a single weighted coordinate, a centre of gravity. However, when you consider the beautiful complexity of these maps, it feels crazy to throw away all of the information that may be contained within the activation path in its entirety. Once more, if we look at the patterns across different individuals, it can be seen that the patterns for each individual are very distinctive, but they vary. So even within our control group, the measures that we've discussed today will scatter across these regions of interest and poorly capture the unique features of each activation pattern. Now, fortuitously, the group that are at the forefront of establishing novel mathematical methods by which we can compare activity patterns were working across the square from me at this time at UCL. And essentially, rather than looking for a single value coordinate by which to activate to represent these activation patterns, the entire pattern is fed into a comparator which looks for the dissimilarity of patterns across different finger pairs. And we compare all combinations of fingers, so the thumb to the index finger, the thumb to the middle finger, and so on, until all 10 finger pair dissimilarities have been computed. So what do such techniques reveal? Well, over the last 5 years, there have been many beautiful findings. For example, in the original paper, they showed that the finger pair that is the most dissimilar is the thumb and the ring finger. The corresponding peak on this graph shows this, fingers 1 and 4. And this measure correlates with the natural statistics of how we use our hands every day. So if we consider the repertoire of movements that we perform throughout the day, the thumb and the ring finger are the most dissimilar in the manner in which they move, which agrees with this metric, the dissimilarity metric. And conversely, if we think about the middle and the ring finger, or the ring and the little finger, these fingers are most commonly used together, and the need to represent them in the brain distinctly is likely to be lower. And the observed dissimilarity measure that we get on fMRI is low. Now, fascinatingly, when we compared musicians to musicians with dystonia, the patterns we obtained were almost identical. So this graph has both healthy musicians in blue and musicians with dystonia in yellow plotted. This is a different graph in which all of the finger pairs, the 10 finger pairs I showed you, have been squeezed down into 2 dimensions so that we can visualize the results better. And again, we can plainly see that the relationship or the dissimilarity of activation patterns for different fingers are almost identical across the groups. Our results suggest that the sensory context does not contain the map or representation for which fingers are symptomatic in dystonia. So this result is very interesting, and we believe it tells us many things about task-specific dystonia. Firstly, it makes a lot of sense. So the sensory cortex is a fundamental area representing sensory function. If abnormal, all sensory function in the hand would be abnormal across all tasks, and this is not the case in task-specific dystonia. If the sensory homunculus is normal, I'd argue this is liberating, as it suggests we can shift our focus to other risk factors that we know are important for the disorder. The manner in which we perform tasks, which tools we use, how our body, both our brain and the body part engaged in the task, function during the performance of the task are all critical to the healthy performance of this skill. We can therefore start to translate known risk factors for task-specific dystonia into mechanisms for the disorder, which allows us to design better therapy. For example, if our results are true, then we do not have a good scientific rationale for therapies such as supertraining the sensory domain, which in the past have included recognising dominoes by touch or learning Braille. Once more, groups that are starting to design novel therapies in line with our results and disease models are starting to have fantastic results. So here is data from Professor Jaume Roset Llover in a centre that specialises in hand therapy for musicians. They have shown complete recovery in over 80% of musicians using new techniques that are built on broader disease models. So overall, mapping the brain in musicians' dystonia has led to fascinating results, and we are really hopeful that these results will take the field forward in new directions with better treatment outcomes. The selective nature of task-specific dystonia can at times lead to the relative neglect of its importance. However, as it always impacts on the livelihood of the individual, I'd argue it's hugely significant. Finally, I'd just like to thank all of the exceptional professional musicians that donated their time to this project and my collaborators, the brains behind these beautiful analytical methods, Tobias Wissler, Navida Jazz and Jorn Didriksen.